There is a moment, and maybe you know this moment, where you are sitting at a family dinner table, surrounded by the people who are supposed to know you best in the world, and you have never felt more alone in your life. Not lonely the way you feel when you are by yourself on a Friday night, lonely in a way that is almost worse, lonely in a crowd of people who share your blood, who have known your face since before you could speak, and who still somehow manage to look right through you like you are made of glass, like you are furniture, like your feelings are weather, inconvenient, temporary, something to wait out rather than something to acknowledge. And you smile. You pass the bread. You ask about someone's job. You hold it all together the way you always do, because you have been holding it together your whole life, and your arms are so tired, but nobody ever seems to notice that either. If that is you, I need you to keep listening, because what I am about to tell you is something that most people in your life have never had the courage or the vocabulary to say to you. And it might change things. There is a particular kind of person who cuts off contact with their family. And when most people hear that, they picture someone cold, someone selfish, someone who could not handle conflict or commitment, someone who gave up. But that is almost never the truth. The truth is almost always the opposite. The people who finally walk away from their families are almost always the ones who stayed the longest, tried the hardest, gave the most, and absorbed the most damage with the least complaint. They are not the ones who gave up easily. They are the ones who never gave up until giving up became the only way to survive. And there is a very specific psychological profile that leads someone to this place. It is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of love. It is actually, and I know this sounds strange, it is actually a consequence of loving too deeply in an environment that did not know how to receive that depth. Let me explain what I mean. Empaths. And I use that word not as a spiritual label, but as a psychological description of people who are neurologically and emotionally wired to feel things at a higher frequency than most. These people do not just sense emotions, they absorb them. Research in interpersonal neurobiology has shown that highly sensitive people who score high on measures of empathy and emotional responsiveness, their nervous systems are actually more reactive to the emotional states of others. Their mirror neuron systems fire more intensely. When someone near them is in pain, they do not just perceive that pain abstractly, they feel something that resembles it in their own body. When someone near them is angry, their own nervous system shifts into a state of alert, even if the anger is not directed at them, even if they did nothing wrong. Now imagine growing up like that in a family that is dysfunctional. Imagine being a child whose whole nervous system is finely tuned to the emotional frequencies of the people around them, and those people are chaotic, or emotionally withholding, or critical, or unpredictable, or simply so consumed by their own unresolved wounds that they have nothing left to give. What does that child learn? They learn to manage. They learn to scan the room the moment they walk in. They learn to read the energy before a single word is spoken. They learn to adjust themselves, shrink themselves, perform versions of themselves that produce the least amount of conflict, the most amount of approval, the safest possible emotional temperature in the room. They become emotional caretakers before they are old enough to understand what that even means. And here is the thing about that kind of childhood. It does not feel like trauma while it is happening, because it is just Tuesday, it is just dinner, it is just the way things are. You do not realize you have been carrying a weight that does not belong to you because you picked it up so young that it feels like your own body. You do not realize you have been walking on eggshells because you have been doing it for so long that the eggshells just feel like the floor. This is what psychology calls an invisible wound, not the kind that leaves marks you can point to. The kind that lives in your nervous system, in your patterns, in the automatic way you brace yourself before you answer the phone when you see a certain name on the screen. And then something happens, and it is different for everyone, but there is almost always a moment where it becomes undeniable. Maybe it is a conversation where you finally say something true, something vulnerable, something that took everything you had to say out loud, and the response is dismissiveness. Or you are turned into the problem. Or suddenly the conversation is about them, and what you said makes them feel attacked. And you find yourself, as you have 1,000 times before, managing their feelings about a moment that was supposed to be about yours. Or maybe it is slower than that. Maybe it is just an accumulation, 1,000 small moments where you left the room feeling worse than when you walked in, where your accomplishments were minimized, or your struggles were minimized, or where the love you felt was always somehow conditional on who you were willing to be in that space. And somewhere in all of that, you start to do what empaths do when they are finally too exhausted to keep absorbing. You start to question yourself. Am I being too sensitive? Am I making this bigger than it is? Is this just family? Is this just normal? Is everyone like this? And I am simply not built for it. That's self-questioning. I want you to hear me say this clearly. That self-questioning is not wisdom. It is a wound talking. It is the internalized voice of every moment you were told, directly or through 100 tiny signals, that your feelings were the problem, that your sensitivity was the problem, that if you could just need a little less, feel a little less, want a little less, everything would be fine. But here's what I want you to sit with. The fact that you feel things so deeply is not the reason things were hard. It was never the reason. Systems that are healthy do not punish sensitivity. Relationships that are nourishing do not require you to consistently minimize yourself to maintain them. Families that are loving do not produce adults who feel like strangers in their own stories. So what happens when an empath finally reaches their limit? What happens is rarely dramatic, at least not on the outside. There is not usually a big blow-up or a scene. What happens is quieter. Something inside just stops. Not out of anger, though there may be anger. Not out of hatred, though there may be grief that looks like that from the outside. It is more like the connection that was always supposed to feel like home simply reveals itself, finally and undeniably, to not be that. And you find yourself standing in a doorway, looking back at something that cost you so much of yourself, and for the first time you can see it clearly because you are not inside it anymore. Psychologists who study estrangement, and there is a growing body of research on this, they have found something that surprises many outsiders. They found that in the majority of adult-child-parent estrangements reported by the adult child, the reasons given are not petty, they are not superficial, they center around emotional abuse, ongoing disrespect, failure to acknowledge harm, and what researchers call consistent invalidation of the adult child's experience. In other words, the people who cut off contact are not running from accountability. They are running from the exhaustion of being consistently told that their experience does not count. And for empaths specifically, this exhaustion has a particular texture. Because the empath did not just survive their difficult family system, they served it. They were the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed things over, the one who called to check in, even when they were not called, the one who forgave quickly because the tension of conflict felt physically unbearable in their body. They were the emotional infrastructure of a system that took and gave back very little of what the empath actually needed. So when an empath finally steps back, they are not abandoning their family. In a very real sense, they are abandoning the version of themselves that the family required them to be. And that is where it gets complicated, because the grief of that is enormous. People on the outside, people who have not lived this, they sometimes say things like, life is too short to hold grudges, or blood is thicker than water, or you will regret this one day. And those words, those well-meaning or not so well-meaning words, land on an empathi, like accusations. Because the empath already knows all of this. They have already held the grief of it 1,000 times before they made the decision. They have already imagined the regrets. They have already asked themselves if they are being fair, if they are being too harsh, if there is one more thing they could try. The empath who cuts off contact is never someone who did it lightly. Every single one of them has a drawer full of unsent letters and unanswered questions, and 3 a.m. moments where they wondered if they made a mistake. That is not what someone who does not care looks like. That is what someone who cares almost unbearably looks like. There is a concept in psychology called ambiguous loss, developed by researcher Pauline Boss, and it describes the particular anguish of losing someone who is still alive, who you might see at a family event, who you might hear about through someone else. It is not clean the way death is clean. It is a loss with no ritual, no casseroles from neighbors, no agreed-upon mourning period. You are supposed to just quietly go about your life as though a fundamental chapter of your identity has not been rewritten. And empaths feel this loss more acutely than most, because they are not just grieving the family they had, they are grieving the family they always hoped they could have. They are grieving a dream of being truly known and truly loved in the place where that was supposed to come most naturally. That grief can take years, and that is okay. It is supposed to. But here is where I want to lovingly, firmly, and without judgment, push back on you a little. Because I said this would be a truth-telling conversation, and I meant it. There is a shadow side to the empath story that does not get talked about enough. And it is this: empaths are extraordinarily good at understanding other people's pain and extraordinarily reluctant to own their own power. The same sensitivity that makes you feel everything so deeply can also keep you stuck in a posture of victimhood long after the situation actually calls for something different. And I say this not to diminish what you have been through, because what you have been through is real, but because you deserve more than a story where you are only ever the one who was hurt. There is a difference between recognizing that a relationship has been harmful and making that harm the permanent center of your identity. There is a difference between protecting yourself from a toxic dynamic and using the story of that dynamic to avoid the terrifying work of becoming fully yourself. Sometimes, and I know this is hard, sometimes the estrangement from family becomes its own kind of comfort zone. A place where you do not have to fully risk yourself in new relationships because you have a reason why intimacy is dangerous. A place where you do not have to fully step into your own life because you are still in the story of the life that was done to you. The wound is real. I want to be clear about that. But wounds can also become identities. And an identity built around what was done to you is a very small house to live in. The most whole, most healed empaths I have ever encountered, the ones who came through incredibly difficult family histories and built lives that actually felt like theirs, they did something remarkable. They let themselves grieve fully, without trying to rush it or explain it or justify it to anyone. They stopped performing their pain for the people who would never understand it, and they stopped hiding their pain from the people who could actually hold it. They found or built what researchers call a chosen family, people who loved them with the kind of love that did not require them to be smaller. And then, when they were ready, they turned toward the future with more energy than they were spending on the past. They did not become hard. They did not stop being empathetic. They did not close off. If anything, they became more themselves. Because it turns out, the sensitivity was never the problem. Being in the wrong container for it was the problem. And here is something I want you to hold on to because I think it is quietly revolutionary. You are allowed to love someone and also recognize that being in close contact with them is harmful to you. These two things can be true at the same time. The love does not have to disappear for the boundary to make sense. You can carry love for your mother or your father or whoever it is in your chest like a private knowing, a soft and complicated ache, without letting that love be the thing that pulls you back into a dynamic that costs you your well-being every single time. Love is not the same as access. This is one of the things that nobody tells you. We are taught, especially those of us who grew up as the caretakers in our families, that love is demonstrated through presence, through endurance, through staying no matter what. But that is not actually what love is. Love can look like presence. It can also look like distance. It can look like I love you, and I also cannot be around you, and both of those things are mine to hold at the same time. If you have cut off contact with your family, or if you are standing at the edge of that decision right now, I want you to know something. You are not a bad person. You are not selfish. You are not broken. You are someone who finally, after years of trying and adjusting and hoping and giving, decided that your own well-being deserved to be a factor in the equation. That is not abandonment. That is, in many cases, the most honest and courageous act of self-respect you have ever performed. And if people in your life do not understand that, if they give you the blood is thicker than water speech, or tell you that you will regret it, you do not owe them an explanation that convinces them. You are not required to make your survival make sense to everyone. Some people will only understand your choices when they have had to make similar ones. And some will never understand. And that is okay, because this was never about getting their approval. Here is what I will leave you with, and I want you to really let it settle. The fact that you feel everything so deeply, the fact that you are the kind of person who holds things gently and worries about impact and lies awake, thinking about people who probably are not lying awake, thinking about you. That is not a weakness. It never was. It was just pointed in the wrong direction for a very long time. You were taught to spend that enormous heart of yours on people and systems that could not value it. And that was not your fault. You were a child. You did what children do. You adapted. You survived. But you are not a child anymore. And the question that is waiting for you, Underneath all of this, underneath the grief and the guilt and the complicated love and the hard decisions, the question is this: now that you are free from the container that told you who you had to be, who do you actually want to become? That question is not a burden, it is a door, and it has been waiting for you for a very long time.